Welcome to Fielding Graduate University and the Worldwide Network for Gender Empowerment's webinar. It's my pleasure to act as your host for the second in a series of webinars on women and violence. And there will be a third in the series. We will talk more about that later. First, let me begin by sharing a little bit of information about Fielding and the Worldwide Network for Gender Empowerment, also known as WNGE. WNGE has been in existence at Fielding as a recognized center for scholar activists for the past 10 years, perhaps even a little bit more, and is undergoing something of a renaissance right now. And I hope that you will join us and learn more about our mission of impacting change by connecting local, regional, and national initiatives to a local community, to many local communities, perhaps yours. For us, we see the world as an ecosystem and intend to impact change in education, poverty, healthcare, the environment, violence prevention, equality, and globalization. We are a recognized and registered non-governmental NGO with the United Nations, and met many of our colleagues at the conference in August, and so perhaps some of you learned of the webinar that way. Let me begin by telling you how we are going to proceed. We have a moderator today for our panel and two panelists. Each will make presentations of about 15 minutes, and then we hope to leave sufficient time for you to enter your questions in the area on the computer, and I will feed those to our moderator, and then we will ask our panelists and moderator to respond. Our panel today is Dr. Margot Okazawa-Ray, faculty member in the School of Human and Organizational Development at Fielding, distinguished colleague of mine, supporter of WNGE, and also a person with a great deal of experience on this topic around the world, in the US and around the world. We are also very delighted to have a colleague, Oksana Yakushko. Let me see if I can offer you a little bit more detail about Oksana Yakushko, who is currently chairing the clinical psychology program at Pacifica Graduate Institute here in Santa Barbara. As you can see from the screen, her scholarly work is quite relevant to today's topic. She's worked in immigration. She has a global perspective on gender violence within the context of multicultural feminist psychology and qualitative research. She's done collaborative work in the Ukraine, her country of origin. She's also built collaborations with other scholars and human rights activists around the world. And she's trained as a counseling psychologist. And I know that you're going to learn a great deal from her presentation. Our second panelist is Fielding graduate Indira Skorich. Indira is an assistant professor at Kingsborough College in New York, and she's also the executive director of the Reconciliation and Culture Cooperative Network. She's worked with the American Friends Service Committee, the International Federation of the Red Cross, and many other organizations, and including a number of women-led activist groups. I'm going to ask Margot, before we begin with the human trafficking presentation, let me ask Margot to make a few opening comments, and then we'll begin with Indira. Margot?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending today, and thank you to our two presenters so much. I'd like us to begin by raising a couple of questions and maybe reminding those of you who attended our first in this series, the conversation about the kidnapping of the Nigerian girls by Boko Haram. So my two questions are, and I hope we can get to these after the presentations, and like you, the audience, to keep these in mind. The first question is, why are women as a group consistently and persistently targets and victims of violence, whether in the form of interpersonal violence to violence during armed conflict and violence related to trafficking? And then the second question is, what are the economic, political, and social forces that undergird, support, and result in impunity for both the social actors and the state actors involved in violence against women? So with these two questions, I'd like to just turn the mic over to our first presenter. Please.
Well, hello everyone, and this is Oksana Yakushka, and I will speak briefly about the tremendous problem and growing problem of human trafficking around the globe. And so, as you can see in the next slide, that it's human trafficking has been termed modern-day slavery, and rightly so, because indeed people are enslaved for a variety of purposes, as we will see. Only I believe that although the human trafficking is a pretty old problem, it's been recently receiving more attention, and I think it's been also increasing in its both spread and reach around the globe for a variety of reasons. Again, we will touch, but one of the things I want to highlight is how difficult it is to study human trafficking, to prosecute it, to address it often. In part, it is because it has been woven into a global criminal activity that is very complex, and it's not, I think some of the perception that it's individual little pockets of criminals that are attacking women or girls and or small groups. It is really those who work in the area recognize it's become a very large scale focus, kind of a problem, and a large-scale controlled, organized activity. One of the reasons it is said to be so profitable is, if you all can think that unlike drugs or weapons, human bodies, women's bodies, can be resold time and time again. So that profitability, so that is, you can see it comes from International Labor Organization that estimates it it's close to $31 billion. Although other scholars continually highlight that both the number of people who are trafficked and the financial outcome of that is really difficult to study and hard to estimate. So in our next slide, I want to highlight one. You can see some of the countries of origin that have some of the highest trafficked individuals, and I think that there is an often perception that trafficking is the problem somewhere else. It is a problem of other countries and cultures that and indeed, United States and Western cultures not only are great recipients of trafficked individuals, they also, it is their economies that often fuel human trafficking. One example is, continued interest in, say, child pornography, which often is, centered in Western countries, and it is children that are sold into slave conditions and abused and violated, whose photography then is shared on the World Wide Web. So human trafficking indeed is everywhere. It's urban and rural problem. And I wanted to show you how quickly it expands. It is dramatic, not in terms of how many millions of people. So there is United States Department of State, if you're interested, produces very interesting, engaging reports that called trafficking in person reports. And you could see in previous slide that in 2009, there were a little over 12 million people. In 2013, there's over 27 million people. So it is just doubled within a really short span of time. And we're talking millions of people, of course, who are estimated to be trafficked. So again, in the, as we go to next slide, we can see that here we're highlighting the trafficking that's related to gender. So I was thinking that my trafficking facts, actually, I was pulling some of my other presentation with millions of children trafficked. I believe the proportionately, these are numbers from 2009. So if you think, again, proportionately, it's more like 4 to 6 million children are trafficked. And as we speak today about gender violence, 80% of those who are trafficked are women and girls. And so 40% are trafficked into commercial sex industries. And these could be strip clubs, brothel escort services, massage services, and pornography. So a variety of those industry related to sex industry in general, into which women and girls are being especially targeted and trafficked into. And most individuals, and as you could, if you studied the trafficking in person reports, you will see such numbers as maybe 40,000 individuals were rescued, or there were the number of cases that are actually tried and then resolved are really minor in contrast to millions of people who are trafficked. In part, as I mentioned, because it occurs within the criminal kind of underbelly of the world, it's very difficult to prosecute, find people. Most individuals do not seek help, and we will, again, I will touch upon some of the reasons why, in part because one of the key reasons for trafficking is debt bondage. So people believe themselves to be indebted to traffickers. They are threatened, their lives are threatened, their family's life are threatened until their debt is paid. And so they do not perceive themselves as victim in the sense maybe you and I would see ourselves as victim in that way. They feel like they owe something to these individuals. And the other piece that we'll briefly touch upon is because they're often placed into activities that are perceived and treated as illegal by these countries of reception, such as prostitution, or such as, for example, growing the drug industry, so that people are trafficked into producing drugs and distributing drugs. So they're unlikely to seek help from officials when they know that they might be perceived as criminally liable. So if we go to next slide, we can also see some of the aspects of what fuels this tremendous increase in trafficking. Of course, you can see in that title, globalization, and by that I mean that the kind of capital, both in terms of the labor organizations or companies, including criminal organizations, what we used to see as kind of country of origin based activities are now really operating on a global scale. And so border crossing, just literally through travel, but especially through technology, become increasingly easy. So these international criminal organizations are both just have a space that's created by these forces of technological and economic globalization that makes it really easy to function in trafficking individuals across borders. So the other aspect is global poverty. And so, of course, most of you know the facts that the poverty and the split between the poor and the rich around the globe continues to increase. Majority of the poverty is bared by women and girls in those situations where they're responsible for carrying out, or it is met through disposable women's bodies, either as laborers or in terms of trafficking them for either forced marriages or sexual exploitation. So these global conflicts, as the next presentation will touch upon, as soon as those begin to occur, they destabilize cultures, and where women and girls' bodies again, and boys' bodies. So boys in Africa, some of you know, who are trafficked into slavery for becoming child soldiers. You know, those begin to occur in countries where the wars you know, erupt and so forth. So another piece I will add is environmental changes. Those of you who that, you know, it's not just it's heating up, or it's that it's becoming increasingly difficult to do agricultural work. There are countries and places where so these changes drive a lot of migration, and people become really vulnerable to trafficking because of that as well. So in the next slide, we will see a little bit of what does organizations such as United Nations and National Organization for Migration and so forth, and the state governments have agreed what are the key features that identify trafficking, which is can be use of force, but often fraud and deception, coercion. And one of the things that people discuss is that it's often conflated with smuggling in such in immigration cases, so people smuggled across borders. Certainly trafficked people could be smuggled, but often they are fraudulently promised things, and they pay some kind of sum of money, and they are indebted. So that kind of indebtment and then being held by force, abuse, fraud, especially coercion, and that is kind of features of trafficking. And here there's an excerpt from former human trafficking person. And again, if you search the web, and we don't have space now, but these are the stories that really highlight the tremendous complexity of trafficking, and how often it is, you know, connected to that sexual exploitation, which could include such grooming processes, promises, you know, promises of visas or work and so forth. And so individuals who enter into such arrangements are often are really seeking better opportunities, better lives, and are enslaved in the process of that. So, and how often it is also set in the context of families that are impoverished, who may especially see their girl children as disposable and as income by, you know, selling them on for labor or sexual exploitation and so forth. So in the next slide, what I want to also highlight that it's commercial sex industry is often the one is emphasized and is a large recipient of trafficking, but domestic servitude. So if you read stories, for example, there are sometimes individuals who, wealthy individuals from certain countries that migrate and bring indentured servants into places like the US and keep them in abuse and terror and so forth. So this domestic servitude can occur without border crossings. So sometimes people could be enslaved and kept for servitude within countries, so within the US. Sweatshops. So sweatshops, we occasionally hear of them existing here in the United States, but certainly around the globe, a kind of insatiable hunger for cheaper goods, better goods, drives creation of sweatshops that are then you know, staffed by individuals who are kept in slave-like conditions. Migrant agricultural work, and there's more and more emphasis in work with migrant agricultural workers in the US and other countries, because they could be trafficked into that. So restaurant, hospitality work, food processing. And as I mentioned, you know, it's hard to name it as an industry, but criminal activities and the drug, in kind of often in, you know, around the globe, insatiable drug needs. And so those are often also fueled by labor that's provided by people who are trafficked. So next slide. as we move to, let's see, like, want to be on the same page as all of you. So modes of trafficking, you know, as we said, brought across borders, very complicated bringing across borders. It is not country A to country B. So people usually are stripped of their documents and they will go through multiple transit countries. So by the time they enter into that country, reception country, it's very difficult to track where these individuals were traveling from and by what means and so forth, so difficult to trace. So in terms of women, so oftentimes people or families, if they do seek women, or if their friends do seek women, you know, it's missing women in many countries are ignored. And so it's, you know, they might have, you know, gone for work and or so forth. So it's in many places, it's really difficult to then trace where people end up. So missing children are difficult to trace, in part because sometimes impoverished families play the role of placing them into you know, hands of individuals who then traffic them. So it's families don't seek them, so very difficult then to locate them. So again, as I've mentioned it, I think we've heard this. So enforcement of payment of debt could be definitely by force and tremendous inducement of fear for their lives, fear for families' lives. Oftentimes people are, you know, if I've studied in cases of stories of women who I returned to Ukraine, and most of them were talking about how they immediately placed on substance abuse cocktails that are extreme. And so they are then really quickly become dependent on traffickers for substances that they need to, you know, keep going. They are held up without sleep, without food. They're repetitively raped and beaten, and so so those kind of events or things that really held people in bondage. The last piece I wanted to notice is that both in the U.S., runaway teens are at really high risk. So they've come from vulnerable communities. I've really liked that there's a growing attention to LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered teens and individuals who are also being trafficked, because they are also at risk for being run away because families may reject them. And so then they're caught into trafficking rings and they're held captive. And so there's growing focus on them, not just in the US, but all around the globe. And so that's, I think, I like that this vulnerability and marginalization really create high risk for people who will be trafficked. So so that was modes of trafficking. So in the next slide, I will also highlight that I've been part of some of the organization communities right now, working for some of the also individuals who are building networks of rehabilitation. Very difficult to do, complicated, because in many cultures, including, say, my culture in Ukraine, having had history of being prostituted or violated in any way, then further makes you unacceptable within that culture. And so what kind of, you know, it's a huge change has to be in the culture shift and perception of women and girls within that culture to accept them, to bring them back into communities as women who are worthy of life and love, and often they're not. So these kind of difficulties make it very difficult to do that work of rehabilitation and make women extremely vulnerable to being re-trafficked again. Again, most victims do not seek help for reasons I've mentioned. As I said, they're being shunned or shamed in countries of origin, sometimes for religious reasons. So I've been working with one individuals in narratives in India. So girls who themselves see themselves as dirty, polluted, bad, and feel religiously impure for the rest of their lives, makes it extremely difficult to then empower them and help them come to some place of strength and healing. So there are some legal provisions, such as trafficking victim protection. So I think it's maybe maybe reverse acts, and they oftentimes are updated what kinds of protection exist, and U.S. enforcement is being and other places in the world trained in terms of recognizing victims of trafficking. For example, in such large venues as we are, Super Bowl, woo, watch a World Cup. Those are huge venues for trafficked individuals. Also, not only building venues and so forth and running the venues, but especially sex trafficking. Organizations for like International Organization for Migration collects some of the UN and so forth. So I've put some resources I found helpful in terms of you interested further in terms of not only information but care for the people who've been trafficked, and the tip lines. And a lot of those tip lines I appreciate seeing in airports, in those of you who in large cities and public transportation and so forth. So they are on television, are being seen more and more. So I'm going to stop here and give the microphone to the next speaker, and look forward to your questions and comments.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Oksana. Lots to think about. So we'll now turn it over to Indira. If you have questions, dear audience members, please send them on your chat, and we'll get to those questions when it's the Q&A time. So Indira, please.
Thank you, Margot, and thank you, Oksana, for setting the stage. I will be talking to you about sexual violence in armed conflict, particularly in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo. And here you see an image of Angelina Jolie, who produced and directed a movie just a couple of years ago that was based on the narratives of women from the Bosnian conflict. Since that conflict, and again, this was in June, the picture was taken in June, we have seen that there was a greater attention to this particular crime against humanity as it became known since that conflict. Bosnia was at war from 1992 to 1995. Some people will call it ethnic war, some people called it aggression. It was definitely a civil war, an armed conflict when Yugoslav Federation fell apart. And we can move maybe a little quicker through this ones. For the first time in 1992, the world heard the term mass rape. And this was also the first time that the United Nations Security Council has ever paid attention to any types of violence against women in conflict. So we learned about a gender-specific form carrying out of genocidal rape, as they at first called it. And that was very problematic term for a lot of feminists and human rights specialists at that time, who pointed out that rape is not only happening at the hands of other nationalities. Genocide and rape are separate crimes and ought to be treated differently by the international community and, of course, international law. At that point, we have also talked about the number of people who have gone through that experience in Bosnia, between 20,000 to 50,000, and this will be a place of major debate. In any event, this was the first rape that we heard in public as a systematic policy and tool of war. It was also considered before this particular case that was just a byproduct, the collateral damage that women suffer. I, at that time, worked with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescents, and when we were interviewing women who were refugees in the camps, we would be told by our colleagues who were old Red Cross employees that this is normal in rape, and this is something that we really needed to address. So even before the cases in Bosnia, we of course have heard somewhat in the early 90s about the comfort women who were forced into sexual servitude during the Second World War by the Japanese army. And it was a long struggle that a lot of women's groups and organizations at that time were trying to address. In early 90s, there were so-called courts for women. They were also trying to force the Japanese government to recognize what kinds of crimes they have been committed. There were also the cases of Bengali women who were raped during the Bangladeshi War of Secession. And at the same time as Bosnian conflict, there was a Rwandan conflict, and we were talking about 200,000 to 500,000 women who were raped. To this day, we hear from time to time in the news that this is still happening in the Republic of Congo, and the estimates go from 200,000 to many more. And you can find really these stories still in public. Just going back to Bosnia and sort of to see how did it work, and this is something that how did this particular rape become public and known, and how did women become advocates of women who were traditionally perceived as silent women who were Muslims. So this was a really unrevealing question. Roy Gutman, who at that time was based in Zagreb, he traveled to eastern Bosnia, and he wrote a story for the newsdays and brought atrocities to the public attention for the first time. What the survivors told him at that time is that they were ordered to be raped. So basically, this really was an indicator. This was a systematic policy that came from the top commands. At that time, we also have heard of the reports that SEAL League, that majority of rapes were done by the Serbian forces. And somewhat this is something that has been an issue for activists and advocates who had worked on with women survivors, because there were also large number of women, other nationalities, who were raped, whether by their own forces within during the war or by other forces. At the same period, Slavenka Drakulic, who is a very well-known feminist and writer, she wrote a story in the Time magazine, and she interviewed survivors who also were telling her the story that they were raped in a systematic and organized way. And we can go a little further on now, next slide. This is a very interesting period. I want you to sort of go back to 1990s, right? And this was happening at the time where, for the first time, we have there was a big international meeting on human rights in Vienna in 1993. And for the first time, survivors were able to speak. Survivors from Bosnia were able, and other parts, were able to speak directly to the policymakers, and they were also able to influence. So what really happened was that the Security Council acted upon those reports and the pressures that other governments had put. So this is an interesting, again, period. We also know that this is the era before the Beijing Conference on Women, where we have a huge shift in a way that for the first time, women's organizations are also adopting the human rights approach. So it was not only that we are looking at the feminist approach, but we were looking as feminists to approach another way of addressing violence against women, right? And in that concept, we have the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia and Rwanda were formed at that time. And the struggle was to address the humanitarian law and to address so-called Geneva Conventions from 1949, when they would describe or talk about rape, or would address rape from a legal perspective. They would talk about protecting the prudence of women. And of course, this was a very different era. It was very clear that rape is not about prudence, that rape is about power relations, and that has to be addressed as a war crimes against women, right? So these kinds of concepts ought to be out there. We have an image of Dragoljub Kunarac, who was the first time either of national or international jurisdiction that was convicted solely for crimes of sexual violence. I do have to mention that the first time that the International Criminal Court for Rwanda was talking about this was the Ayesha case, and it was very important case because it really brought to the world's attention that these crimes are not only happening when there is a media attention, or if you want, whether their state actors are interested in some sort of violence against women. Julie Merters, who is a scholar, has talked that it was very important at this point to understand the international networks of women and whether it's a local or national level that work together to address this. We do have a lot of controversy, particularly in the former Yugoslavia. The public attention was there only for about 6 months or 8 months, and then the story disappeared from public. As our number of colleagues would say, as if the rape stopped, as if it didn't happen after 1992 and early 1993. So there was this thing that whether this particular agenda was used to bring in public relation campaigns, or whether women were used and abused by their stakeholders, or whether there was a great other importance on discussions what feminism is in this particular context, whether it would, if we talk about sexual violence in war, we could actually also talk about what's happening in day-to-day life. We still are in conversation about sexual violence in war. If you read the newspapers, you will see that ISIS is using it, of course, and this is an important aspect of it, but then we don't know how much of that was happening, let's say, in Libya or in Syria. In any of these conflicts, we have the snippets of the story, partially because it's so hard to get the story out, partly because there is probably not such a huge media interest. The UN Security Council has acted on that, has adopted a specific resolution that addresses the sexual and the sexual violence in war. So there has been a huge normative move from the place where the issue of sexual violence in war was not at all heard to become recognized by the international humanitarian law. So let's go to the next slide, that we could really bring the little bit of this attention to the research that I have done at Fielding Graduate University. And one of the things that really I wanted to show you was like just as a case study, but also as a comparative study, how one particular conflict and one group of survivors got a very huge attention by the international community, and how did this organizing and advocacy really reflect in their own life stories. So I have conducted life story interviews with 12 survivors at that time, and this is particularly a humbling experience, and I think that that's the experience that really anybody who comes to the point where he or she has an opportunity to get to the stories in a way how people want to tell their stories. And I have looked at this through the research on transformative learning, and the particular complexity around the issues of transformation that might not always be a good thing, or that we need to take the judgments away, why some people decide to take an active role and speak up not only in the court system, but also to speak up in public about what had happened to them in this particular setting, specifically in the places where women are largely discouraged to share those kinds of experience. So in a way that this particular research is also adding to the body of studies of learning in adulthood as a consequence of organizing around sexual violence. So I will continue with that and maybe just give you some snippets. So they, in this field of transformative learning, usually people will talk about the trigger events. So and even when after more than 2 decades of working with survivors and personally knowing some of them, and as a survivor myself, I have gone into this research with the notion that maybe the event itself, the violence itself, has triggered that particular learning or growth or a decision for them to move on, to speak up. What I have really found is that all the participants really, for them, the most important was that they were, at the time when they were in the women's center, when they were in the places of exile and refuge, when they were together as women, whether that has actually helped them become who they were as advocates. The trigger events itself, sometimes people have various concept of that, but some Stephen Brookfield calls it trigger event measure, and others in the field call it disorienting dilemmas. It's not like one thing that happens. It's really a lot of things that help ignite that transformation. So the work in the Women's Center wasn't only around services that they were receiving and who were the people who were providing those services, whether they were recipient or whether they were passive as victims. And this becomes really a huge and interesting part to study, whether victims and around victimhood and survivorhood, where perception is always that women are victims, right? And in this particular case with survivors in Bosnia and in Kosovo, the victimhood or survivorhood were constantly questioned. Sometimes they use their victimhood to take an active role, to become known. For instance, they were able to change the laws in Bosnia, so they were recognized as a civilian war victims. So in a way, the survivorhood became victimhood in that concept. And sometimes I debate with my colleagues about those notions, because this is in a way something that we have borrowed from medical field. It's not necessarily as easy to be translated into social conditions so complex as the war is in sexual violence. One of the participants shared her story, how she really didn't necessarily plan to become who she is. In her life, she might have been better educated, she trusted the law, she was a judge and a lawyer, but she never thought that she will be somebody who will become an activist. And then she's also an advocate, and she's also more aware of what's happening in her community. And she's from Kosovo, and she definitely talks about various ways that she was offered things to do in the women's centers and to learn as an advocate. And maybe we can, so I will just quickly again go to major findings. It was extremely important, although very debatable, whether that whole media attention was useful or less useful. It was definitely instrumentalized by the state actors, but it was also important that it became a shared trauma experience for general population in Bosnia. So it addressed that divide between women who have gone through the experience of rape and women who didn't, who were lucky in a way, to use that word. The Balkan Muslim women were newly syncretistic, and I would leave that open. Basically, they were introduced to the concept of feminism from bottom up, not necessarily that many of them would identify themselves as feminists before, but they certainly had a very close-knit culture that allowed them to be extremely close and open with one another and to accept one another without judgments, which is something that the women in the Balkans are now addressing it, because they will in March hold the first courts of women in sexual violence, because they felt that a lot of things have been done on national and international law level, to criminalize the cases, but they're not really happy only with that concept of justice. They have a concept of that justice that's more feminist.
Indira, we're quickly running out of time, so maybe you can just quickly wrap up. We only have about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure we have time for comments.
Thank you very much, and I will just leave it as it is. Thank you, Margot, and
Okay.
I'm looking forward to receive questions.
Yes, thank you very much to both Oksana and Indira. I'll make closing comments at the end, but let's take some of the questions we have. And I think having that, the comment about, you know, how women have experienced some of these things we're talking about is very, very helpful. One of the questions from the participants has to do with the idea that many times the girls and women may not see themselves as, quote, victims. So how do NGO clinicians work with the girls and women to break the traumatic bond between victim and trafficker? And I would just like to say survivors, I guess, as well as, you know, being victimized. And maybe Oksana, this is over to you.
Yes, it is. That's one of the most complex aspects of trafficking, since many, like the question says, women and girls do not see themselves as victims, right? So in that sense, so one of the strategies, I think, in addition to really active educational campaigns that do encouraged and ongoing around the world in vulnerable communities that educate people, even those sometimes, if you see those, I saw just a few TV ads and so forth, that what we perceive as people's choice, or choice by, they decided to pursue a risky endeavor of entering another country. Individuals need to understand that any kind of situations like that where they feel indebted and bonded, and if there's a violence that occurs to keep them there, that is illegal, and that is trafficking. And so how that is brought to women and girls is really complex. And so I see how NGOs and creatively, in terms of reaching out to these communities, their flyers, I've seen some really clever ways that people put out information so that it can reach the individuals who are trafficked. Because a lot of the stories we hear from survivors who come forth are people who figure it out one way or another and escape. And so what we don't hear is how do individuals themselves who stay, continually perceive themselves as indebted. So I guess I think it's there's no clear answers, but I think it is the educational campaigns and information. It is training of law enforcement officers, because oftentimes what I've seen in the stories too is that enforcement officers who, for example, pick up a child or young adult in quote-unquote criminal activity and treat them as such would further drive them towards their pimps or traffickers rather than towards law enforcement. So it's really complex situation that needs to be addressed on so many levels with, I think, training, education, and campaigns of making it visible, giving people voice and making it visible. So I'll stop here.
Margot, we can't hear you if you're on mute.
Sorry. Another question pertains to the use of technology to cross borders. So that perhaps is an interesting question. I think a real central question here is this idea of bottom-up feminism. What does that mean in practice, right? And maybe Indira, you can speak to that. You talked about syncretistic idea. So very briefly, how would you respond to that? A bottom-up feminism.
It's interesting. I will speak specifically in Boston case. That this particular, it has to do with the fact that women were to a certain level educated in a society that gave equal rights to men and women. Whether we are thankful or not thankful to the Communist Party's ideas about that, of course, everybody was aware that that didn't really mean the equality of women in everyday life. We have even some writing at that time that people not understanding why is this happening in the country where where the law provides equality of women, right? So this is a huge question between whether legal aspect is going to change or the legal norms are going to change the society and stop one violence against women of occurrence. And this is where we are sort of debating. What I feel it's very important to understand is that in many cultures, women build networks that necessarily we are not aware as feminists when we go in. I recall one of the survivors telling me how important it was for her in our interview process that I didn't ask her questions directly, that I allowed her to tell the story in her way, that she also told the stories with songs and the way how she wants to present it. And that's a huge issue, how we have certain concepts as you say, global feminists or people who are considering universal human rights to be applicable everywhere. Because in some cultures, women might develop certain ways of dealing with trauma. That doesn't mean that they are feminists. That could be helpful when we are trying to, if you will, for the lack of better word, use the empower women in that sense. So in a way, that would be what I mean in this concept. Given that this was an isolated group of Muslim women in the society, they were very much building certain relationships among themselves, and I mean particularly relationships of trust. And this is something, or non-judgment, this is something that as feminists we always preach, but it's also hard to recognize it. So I hope that this makes some sense.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. And there's a final question. Because we're an educational institution, we should probably take up the question of, what area of research might be very important to address the problem of human trafficking. Oksana, over to you.
Yeah, I think it's just vast. I think from I think certainly I'm going through both NGOs and in national organization and State Department, even research in terms of what occurs with rehabilitation, what works, what help survivors, how to address the. I know in Ukraine there was a interesting set of studies about that in urban areas individuals were entering with educational campaigns and saying things like, you would not sell yourself for $100, to these girls or in rural areas, and what they were finding is that the girls were saying, yes, I would. Where do I get $100? I have no income and no future. So what kind of things work and do not work? So some of the community-based research, working with communities themselves, working with survivor groups themselves. And so the research to me, I feel like is really could be also in terms of how we perceive as society. So a study of kind of from more systemic perspective, what drives trafficking from really more kind of systemic societal level. So I think, goodness, if all of us at least give it voice, I think qualitative research, giving voice to people, making it visible, doing our part to just really address different aspects of it, I think that we could make such a difference in that world, I hope.
Okay, thank you very much. Since we're running out of time, I'd just like to just kind of summarize some of the main themes that I think were mentioned by both our presenters. first of all, the scale of the problem is huge, right? But it's not necessarily, especially for those of us in the U.S., not necessarily visible. So when does a problem become huge enough that it gets the attention of people who could make a difference in doing something about it? Also, both speakers talked about the connection between global capitalism, militarism, patriarchy, and trafficking and violence against women in armed conflict situations. We know that one very specific example of Dynacor setting up a whole kind of a trafficking prostitution ring in Bosnia during the conflict, and the collusion of the private corporation, local officials to exploit women. That's a very concrete example. I also want to remind people of the 1995 rape of the 12-year-old girl in Okinawa, when the Pacific commander of the U.S. forces said those 3 men who raped that girl were stupid. They could have just bought a quote bought a prostitute, right? So the kind of official collusion. I'm thinking also of the whole, Oksana mentioned this idea of vulnerable people. It's not just any old person who finds themselves in a situation of being trafficked or being victimized and being a survivor in armed conflict. And I'm wondering also about these vast structural inequalities between the countries of the North and South, where we in the North benefit enormously from the trafficking and even from atrocities like what's happened in Bosnia, where the private corporations reap enormous profits as a result of the horrific things that are happening. I'm also mindful of the global South in the North. So poor girls in Richmond, California, getting trafficked from Richmond to Oakland, for example, and how that for sexual exploitation, or the women being trafficked from the Philippines into the wealthier Middle Eastern countries as indentured servants. So looking at all these kinds of inequalities, I think are absolutely crucial. And then finally, thinking about, I really appreciated Oksana's point about really contesting this idea of choice, right? What really constitutes choice when people don't have economic means or any kind of structural access to goods and resources for survival? And finally, relevant to our whole series is the role of patriarchy and patriarchal values in all the cultures that we've discussed so far, and we'll be discussing in the last series as well. And finally, since we're all located here in the U.S., I'm assuming, you know, what do our demands for labor, for iPhones, all these things that we consider necessities, what do our demands have to do with what goes on around the world? Somebody raised the question about, the DRC. Well, one of the big things happening there is the securing of coltan for our cell phones. So again, making these connections, I think, between the North and the South, between the demands of people here in the U.S. With what's happening around the world are really important. And finally, the question always comes of, what's to be done about it. So Oksana and Indira both have spoken about ways to deal specifically with survivors, but I also think there's a way to think about the kind of organizing and consciousness raising that needs to happen to address the impunity with which perpetrators, get to commit their crimes. Right. So those are the kinds of things I've heard, and I hope the questions raised and the points made by our panelists will have you all thinking for days and really thinking about what's our role as people of conscience in the U.S. Or in the global North. Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Margot, very much. Thank you, Oksana. Thank you, Indira. There's been a request for contact information for both Indira and Oksana, and so I will ask each of them to send me what they prefer as their contact information, and I will add it both to our website, which is on your screen right now, and also perhaps we can add it to the slides that will be part of the recording, which will be also linked to our website. I want to thank them. As I said, I have so much to say and so little time to say it that all I can do is to ask you to continue to join with us in WNGE, to participate in ongoing discussions on the webinar at wng.fielding.edu or on our website, fielding.edu/WNGE. We also have a Facebook page. And also, please join us on October 15th for the third in this series. I'm very, very appreciative of your attendance and your questions and your participation. And I hope that we will continue together as a community of scholar activists attempting to do something about gender empowerment and gender equity in the US and around the world. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. We're still on, right?
Yes, I'm trying to see now. Well, let me stop recording. All right, Anna.